I'd like to thank Caroline and the Kent team for inviting me. I'd like to acknowledge really that it's a privilege to speak in this capacity and to have this platform, and I am aware of my relative privilege, so I feel it's a responsibility to use this opportunity in a responsible manner. I mean, I think hubris can come about in assuming that privilege is somehow merited through hard work, whatever it might be. And I think merit assumes that we deserve what we get. So I think it's really important for my talk that we acknowledge the kind of favourable conditions or unfavourable ones structurally that allow people these kinds of platforms, and the nature of luck in that. And I think combined with that, I think it's important as well, although this is me speaking, my scholarship isn't mine entirely. It's woven in collaborations and conversations over a long period of time with many people that I've worked with, that I continue to work with. And so in that sense, what I'm saying is the fruit of collaboration, which these are themes I want to return to through the talk about the nature of scholarship. And I think the apology comes about is largely around the kind of fragmented nature of what I'm going to be talking about, because I think the way you'll see these slides go and my train of thought, I think we are living in a time where it's particularly difficult to be coherent and clear. So having fixed thoughts about profession and what's emerging are difficult to obtain at the moment. So my thoughts are somewhat fragmented, so that's an apology really by way of starting. So I'm going to start with, if this works, there we go. Can you see the next slide? Okay, great. So a kind of reminder really about the knowledge strands of EAP. There are three distinct strands. We'll be most familiar with the knowledge of genre and discourse, which is mainly linguistic in nature. We also are fairly familiar with the epistemological basis of different disciplines and a form of knowledge which is essentially philosophical in nature. But the third strand, the sociological or anthropological nature of EAP, is perhaps less familiar and less explored in the literature. And I think this is something I want to explore briefly. Liz Hamp-Lyons, in I think her last JEEP tutorial, said that the socio-political and economic imperatives for the rise of EAP we described in 2002 are, if anything, more serious and indeed deeper issues than they were then. But they have barely appeared in the pages of JEEP in recent years. And I'll skip a bit, but there seems to have been little uptake, at least in this journal. So the political, sociological dimensions of EAP have been underexplored, and this is borne out in the following slide. There's very recently a published article looking at the empirical articles published in Journal of English for Academic Purposes. Now, you might not be able to see on your screen, but coming in at 10th, or equal 10th, are the socio-political aspects of EAP. And they sit right at the bottom of the top 10, where 2.9% of articles published in JEEP have a socio-political orientation. So this would seem that the research community as such within EAP have not really given it the attention it deserves, and is certainly a relatively marginal interest. But that's not really the full story. There have been plenty of other articles and books that have dealt with this, starting with Greg Hadley's book, English for Academic Purposes in Neoliberal Universities. There's mine and Ian's book that Caroline mentioned. There's B. Bond's book, which has just been published, Making Language Visible in the University, which deals with very pertinent issues around the nexus of language content, EAP practitioners and subject lecturers and students. Ken Hyland caused quite a stir with his academic publishing and the myth of linguistic injustice, where he suggested that L2 researchers are at no material disadvantage compared to L1. There's a brilliant article by Mary Davis on publishing research as an EAP practitioner, opportunities and threats, which revealed some of the obstacles for publishing for practitioners, including discouragement from colleagues and managers. There's Christian Chun's book on power and meaning making in an EAP classroom. These are all dealing with socio-political issues within the field. I'd like to really draw your attention and encourage you to go and look at two Ed.D. theses that were published this year that I examined. One is by Sarah Taylor, and it's called An Inquiry into How English for Academic Purposes Practitioners Construct Their Professional Identities. And the other one by Kate Jones, The Position and Professional Status of the Tutor of English for Academic Purposes in Higher Education. Both of them are freely available online, and both of them provide quite rich insights into the perspectives of practitioners around identities and status. We're also, as editor of the Bloomsbury series, there are 3 publications coming out or will be coming out, one by B. Bond and Ian Bruce on contextualizing English for academic purposes in higher education, one by myself and a colleague, Michelle Evans, on social theory, and there's a call for papers for an edition that Letitia Monbeck and I are doing on practitioner identity and agency. So if you want to submit a paper for that, please feel free. So these are indicative of the ways in which it's not quite the full story if you look at the published articles, that in the sense that politics is of concern to the practitioner. And to kind of reinforce this, I've just put a kind of scrapbook type slide up to kind of emphasize the way in which politics is fully infused in all discussions in the media around higher education. And they vary from articles around that the opening of universities was illegal, pressurizing staff to work on campus, keeping students at all costs in accommodation until after fee deadlines. There are issues around the impact of the on academic work for in relation to gender. There are all sorts of things going on, including to a certain degree the government trying to induce a kind of culture war on campus around free speech. There was a slightly comical element to all of this as well, when you may have seen the video by the Vice Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, which is at the bottom left of my slide, where he produced a kind of fairly appalling video explaining how safe the University of Birmingham campus was, and it involved a rather satirical hashtag around Save Charlotte, who is a personal assistant of the Vice Chancellor. We also had very confident, overconfident senior management kind of discourse around COVID safe university. For example, on the top right, from the registrar at the University of Nottingham, who basically was accusing the union and others of fear-mongering around COVID, when University of Nottingham then, within a couple of weeks, had, I think, the highest rate of COVID on campus with over 2,000 cases. So all of this is kind of indicative of the way in which politics is part of our environment and part of the shaping of EAP and higher education generally. So these are the kinds of issues on this slide that I think have been bubbling alongside discussions more around more pragmatic areas of adapting to online learning. And they can be seen in things around discussion of race and related to that, decolonising the curriculum, inclusivity, precarity, the impact, the unequal impact that lockdown has had on women academics. There are high levels of redundancies or threatened redundancies in higher education. There's a continuing politicisation of HE through funding, the imposition of kind of a cultures war. There are serious questions around senior university leadership. And there's also something that was been little noticed, which is the politics of digital education. I've included this in the links to the PowerPoint, so you can look for yourself. But there's a joint DISC report, which is looking at supporting startup companies to get a foothold within higher education, digital education. And this includes, for example, as we've seen, large corporations offering services for free during COVID in the hope that post-COVID, the universities will buy into their products. At Leeds, we've had the appointment of a new interim Deputy Vice Chancellor for Digital Education, and where you can kind of read between the lines that this is digital is going to be used for what he calls a cultural transformation of the institution, which goes beyond simply digital education, but also work practices. And I think the advent of micro-credentials and an instrumentalization of higher education. All of us have felt the impact and we're reflecting on workloads. As you know, as you probably feel, the work is somewhat relentless, and working from home in particular often feels there are a few boundaries between home and work life. I'm kind of going through this rather quickly. I'm also concerned about the micropolitics of EAP centres. Senior management often talk about keeping the pipeline open, which is a really unfortunate expression where the kind of imperatives of the language centre making sure that the flow of international students into higher education this year is maintained. So in a way, it's kind of exposed or made much clearer the, if you like, the service role of EAP in making sure that this continues. I've listened to some very innovative talks this morning around pedagogy online, and I think there'll be others this afternoon. But I think also I've noticed anecdotally perhaps, but through conversations with colleagues elsewhere, that the going online has also drawn out a kind of pedagogy of pragmatism where more innovative and more exciting aspects of pedagogy have been jettisoned in under the guise of pragmatism, and some of the courses that do go online have been reductive in that respect. So in a sense, it's also playing out tensions between perhaps more adventurous pedagogies, more innovative ones, and ones which are perhaps more familiar, and so on. The other aspect around centres that's also can be disconcerting is that often language centres have been suggested that they accept a whole variety of kind of language assessments which they wouldn't do normally. Sometimes this has been negotiated, and at Leeds we've been able to take more than a lead on that, but I do know that other universities have had this foisted upon them. So it's kind of exposed a whole wide range of areas that we're facing. And it's not just us that are facing it as practitioners, it's the whole of higher education. So, is there any good news in all of this? Well, I think there is. If we take, for example, the TELSIG, which is the technology SIG, throughout the coronavirus period, I think they've organised something like 8 webinars and a conference, and have been extremely active in trying to support colleagues across EAP in order to help and be collaborative and supporting and going online. The other good thing I'd like to draw attention to is the EAP for Social Justice SIG, which has provided a very fruitful platform for discussing issues that are normally left somewhat obscure. And in particular, the seminar that they organised around race and EAP, I attended that and I found it very, very interesting and very thoughtful discussions around decolonisation. At Leeds, B and I organised a week-long international event on precarity, where we organised it so that precarious practitioners had a central platform in discussing issues around precarity and EAP. So we have a supportive community out there, and I'd like to reiterate something that Olwyn said in her plenary. And I've been looking at the number of messages on the BALEAP mailing list, and by comparison, for example, in February this year and March this year and April, the number of messages that were exchanged, for example, in February this year was 155, and the previous year 74. In March this year it was 250, the previous year 97. In April this year 224, and the previous year 44. Most of the discussions that were taking place during that period were very practical, pragmatic discussions that provided all of the community with advice, support around different kind of tests, different technological solutions, and that's where you see the value of a community. As you can see possibly on your screen, for October this year, there were only 48 messages, whereas the previous year there were 93. So maybe also there is a certain fatigue coming in. So I've kind of argued up to now that I think the politics of EAP and looking at the political environment is a legitimate concern for us, particularly at the moment. And it's maybe both the ideal time and the worst time to be contemplating this. And this is why on this slide I've called it, as a question mark, a fractured reflexive moment. This is drawing on the work of the critical realist Margaret Archer, who her main thrust of her work is looking at reflexivity to agency and structure. And one of the reflexive categories that she talks about is fractured reflexives. And this is when the internal conversations that we have actually are obstacles to thinking. In other words, we're unable to think clearly and coherently about something, and that leads to a kind of paralysis in action. This is possibly what we're faced with at the moment in some ways. And Bourdieu uses this notion of hysteresis, which is, I'll define it, which is when that belief, well adjusted to a prior situation, misfires in the present as the complicity with environmental conditions necessary for effective practice is broken. What this means is there is a time lag between habitus and field, or more prosaically, between our routines and the environment. In other words, the normal ways that we go about our work within the field of EAP don't match the conditions of the field. In other words, you can use, Bourdieu uses the analogy of sport and the field for playing a game. And we understand the game, we understand our position in the game, and we play it in ways that are kind of pre-reflexive. At the moment, we're in a situation where the field of EAP and higher education isn't known. It's not known well. We're in the midst of quite massive changes, I think. So our routines, our ways of behaving and thinking are not in line with that. So that's why I call it, in a sense, a contradiction. It's sort of the ideal moment for thinking about who we are, what we're doing, but the conditions mean that we are constantly preoccupied with the present and making do and innovating with online education. I'm going to introduce two very different ideas around reflexivity. The first one is very counterintuitive, and it's reflexivity as disinterestedness. This is again borrowed from Bourdieu's work. And it's a systematic exploration of the unthought categories of thought, which delimit the thinkable and predetermine the thought. Now, this is typical Bourdieu, it's very, very dense. What it essentially means is a critical and reflexive position with regard to both our own discourses and forms of social doxa. Doxa means orthodoxies. So it's a way of rethinking and re-envisaging what we do by examining the kinds of things that we take for granted. This seems to be important, and in order to do that, we need to objectify and to systematically, with some distance, evaluate what we do as practitioners and what EAP is. The disinterestedness comes from a distance or a gap, and that's why the objectification of what we do is important. Through this process of objectification, we end up with alternative accounts of and perspectives of our sociocultural world that are not necessarily compliant with the meanings and narratives associated with the powerful ways in which we do represent EAP. So it gives us an alternative way of looking at what we're doing through disinterestedness. I'm not going to labour the point. I'm going to move on to perhaps a more familiar view of reflexivity. I can get my slide to change. There we go. This is a very different one, and it comes again from Margaret Archer. And she states that who we are is a matter of what we care about most and the commitments we make accordingly. So she links the internal conversations we have about the social world and action. And self-transformation entails projects which involve self-modification, but which are also expressions of social critique and quest for social transformation. Our personal aspirations and our social expectation can only be resolved by practical action. So this refers to the kind of gap between, in a sense, the way that we would like the world to be and what we want to do and what's expected of us is not something that exists in the head, it exists through the actions that we undertake. But this is on a very individual level. And some of us perhaps dedicate what we consider to be of social value outside of our work. We engage in social actions which are not directly related to our activities as practitioners. However, she also uses a term called corporate agency, which is typical powers, our capacities for articulating shared interests, organising for collective action, generating social movements, and exercising corporate influences in decision making. That's basically the special punch that we have when we associate, when we collaborate, and when we join together in order to try and change our social world. Now, clearly, the most obvious example of a corporate agency is a profession of which BALEAP is our professional body. And the defining features of the profession are association, self-governance, control over training, ethics, and trust. BALEAP doesn't have all of those elements. It doesn't have control over training, self-governance up to a point. Ethics and trust remain implicit, I think, within the profession rather than explicit. So I'd like to return to the first slide, where one of the strands of EAP knowledge is of disciplinary cultures and values, a form of knowledge which is essentially sociological or anthropological in nature. And I think we can turn that within EAP itself. If we look at EAP and think it also has a social life like any other, with its distribution of power, its monopolies, its struggles and strategies, interests and profits. So we have an epistemology of EAP, what the knowledge base, and we evaluate that on the basis of our own critical evaluations of that. But also, it exists as a social field of production of knowledge, which involves people. So it has its struggles, it has its monopolies, its gatekeepers, and this, in a sense, refers back to the kind of apology and acknowledgement I gave at the beginning. So we need to look at EAP in that sociological way as much as we look at the disciplines that we investigate. So some of the issues, and I'm getting near the end now, that politics raises is perhaps a noticeable, if you like, a reticence to engage with politics within the profession. The BALEAP mailing list often has kind of eruptions of discussions around politics that tend to dissipate somewhat, or they end up being a little bit antagonistic and the conversation peters out. Or commentators say, you know, this is a professional forum, political views essentially not welcome at times. I've also been very ambivalent about the emergence of the social justice SIG. I was delighted that it came into existence as a safe space in the right sense of the word to raise issues around things like precarity, race, inclusivity, and other issues that relate to social justice. But it also occurred to me that perhaps this kind of quarantines discussions around politics and the more kind of worldly elements of our work. So it's sort of like an annex to the main body of BALEAP's work. There's also perhaps a notion that it's very open to all and any elements of social justice, but does that lead to it being slightly unfocused? We have to acknowledge that there's a heterogeneity of practitioners' views and beliefs, both political and professional, and the two ED theses bring that to light very clearly. The political range of views that I've heard from practitioners in passing is basically the full spectrum. So it kind of is not aligned to a myth that we're all left-wing and that we're all in line politically. There is much more divergence of views than perhaps meets the eye. I think one of the issues we also face is because we operate with different roles, we are located in different parts of the university, we have different titles, we have different agency, we have different ways that centres are run, we have different sense of opportunities, and perhaps that to a certain degree at times weakens solidarity amongst us. The scholarship of EAP, is it representative of the field? Again, I'm very aware that there is a lack of equality of opportunity through workloads, through encouragement, and also through practitioners' own sense of whether they want to do scholarship or they think it's part of their identity of teachers. The last bullet point says critical EAP largely failed practitioners. This can be quite misunderstood. What I mean by that is I believe to a large degree that critical EAP has in some way failed practitioners, because it often presents quite dichotomous binaries around the accommodationalist practitioner or the transformative. So it often operates along binaries which don't represent the nuances and spectrum of practice. So Bourdieu provides again this nice comment: if sociology is a critical science, and perhaps because it is itself in a critical position, and perhaps it might be useful to think of EAP as a critical science. I'm not suggesting here at all that we politicize EAP, because I think Bourdieu again provides a nice way of looking at this, to think politics without thinking politically. And I'll come back to that, but essentially the politics of our world is worthy of scholarship discussion without it necessarily being presented as being something which is political in itself. I'm going to skip the last bit because time is running out quite rapidly. So, defining any core concerns that we may have, well, we do have specialized knowledge, and we can speak with authority and symbolic capital. We have areas of expertise that we can contribute scholarship around, and I'm thinking about the Bond book in particular, where he's talking about the role of language in higher education. This is of interest to HE practitioners. It's also been of interest to people in the field, much higher up in university management. I think we need to think of scholarship with commitment, and again, we're looking at debunking and critically challenging the kind of taken for granted assumptions about our world. These open up new possibilities, but they don't define them. They offer us ways of looking at the world that are not prescriptive. The scholarship that we do is performative in the sense that by doing it, we are offering ways of changing how we see the field and therefore how we act in it. And scholarship is also, I think, again, following Bourdieu, a lot of his work was done collegially and collaboratively. The best work that we can do in scholarship is collaboratively. It's not individually. It's working together towards shared goals. So to finish, some fairly simple suggestions. I think we should fight for equality of access to engage with and produce scholarship across the sector. We should support colleagues where we can, where they don't have the same opportunities, and we should put pressure on those centres to enable that to happen. We should legitimise the integration of socio-political dimensions of our work in our discussions. Scholarship. We should also investigate less fashionable aspects, such as the sociology of work, and I've put the return of work in critical theory as the next example of kind of reading that all managers and practitioners should read. We should balance activist scholarship with a scholarship of activism, and by that means it's the tension between objectifying the world and participating in it. So activist scholarship is the doing of it, and the scholarship of activism is the critical distance we have from the orthodoxies that emerge within universities. And I think it'd be interesting, finally, to organise an event, and I'm thinking of a PIM or something like that, where we deliberately focus on the experiences and ideas and theories from those that are considered from the periphery and not the metropole of EAP. I'm thinking about people who work in low resource areas where, you know, there is underfunding, where we don't hear much from, where we can perhaps learn a great deal. So those are kind of my fragmented thoughts. So thank you very much.